All right, I see it, so it's all yours.
Great, thank you. And you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. The intelligence in ambiguity. Hello, I'm Katy133. I'm a visual novel developer who has been releasing VN since 2013. I'm the creator of Dear Devere, Last Meal at Cafe Mori, and Ghost Switch. Today, I'm going to be talking about the intrigue in ambiguity and how ambiguous design can strengthen your visual novel. We'll be covering several areas from art style to dialogue writing to plot structure to character design and more. I'll also be using various story-focused games and other works to help illustrate points. So what is ambiguity? Ambiguity can be defined as the quality of being open to more than one interpretation. So anything that can be interpreted in different ways is ambiguous. With that definition placing us all on the same page, let's begin with one way to use ambiguity. The art, the visual part of visual novels. Certain art styles can invite the player to fill in the blanks. Minimalism. This art technique is about telling as much as you can with as little as possible, aiming for simplified forms, requiring the artist to reduce many elements from the subject. What is left becomes more important and more focused upon in defining the subject. Pixel art, because of its nature of being blocks of larger pixels, is a style that leaves things up to a player's imagination. It has the artist edit the art on a pixel by pixel level, so every block of color counts. Looking at this example, we can see how the player character Guybrush Threepwood from The Secret of Monkey Island looks as pixel art, and then look at two different artistic interpretations of his design. One from the original 1990 version of the game and the special edition remake, two interpretations of the same pixel art. Animators Lotte Regner and Michel Ocelot have used a style known as silhouette animation for much of their work, blocking out the characters as black cutouts. Michel Ocelot said in an interview for his animated anthology film, Tales of the Night, that he liked how the style allowed the viewer to imagine the details of the characters, including skin tone and hair color, putting a bit of themselves into the characters. This artistic choice also allowed the backgrounds to include a lot of detail and color without causing too much busyness, clutter, or color merging that could have occurred if the characters were also fully colored. Surreal art. Surrealism is a technique of using symbols over realism to convey ideas. It's often described as dreamlike, operating on a different set of rules from reality. When we see something that looks impossible in a work, we question the perception of the protagonist. Is what they're seeing real? Is it in the character's head? Are there some works that never answer that question? It sets us up to question the character we're viewing the world through. A special note on horror. Horror and ambiguity go well together because a lack of knowledge of the threat in the story can increase the fear of it. As director Alfred Hitchcock put it, I believe in putting the horror in the mind of the audience and not necessarily on the screen. There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. A more ambiguous art style in horror makes the player use their imagination to fill in the gaps, even when you do show something, making things scarier than if you showed the monster in full detail. It's one of the reasons why many developers still opt for pixel art in horror games, even with technology offering other options to use. An example of this is the atmosphere in The Witch's House. The pixel art and the darkened lighting, obscuring things, has you imagining things that are described in journal entries. Character designs. There are various design choices you can make to hide the face of your characters. This type of character design can be appealing because we have to fill in the blanks, projecting ourselves and our tastes into the character. Masking a character can also dehumanize them, giving them an intimidating mask design that can have an almost skull-like quality. Sometimes in the story these characters are in, there's a face reveal moment, and sometimes there isn't. Choosing whether to ever reveal a character's face can be a difficult decision to make, as showing the face might be a disappointment. Unless the reveal says something with it, it can often be better to never include a reveal and leave it up to the player. A word on faceless protagonists. Visual novels will sometimes choose to make the player character faceless. Doing this can allow the player to fill in the blanks to show how they personally prefer, like a character customization screen that gives the player appearance choices. Telling the story through a first-person camera helps to hide the face of the player character. Cinematography is the art of motion picture photography. While visual novels are a different medium from film, the knowledge of cinematography will help you make decisions in designing your VN. Cinematography can be used for CGs or any visuals in your VN. You can make decisions on things like the position of the camera to hide things from the player, blurring the screen as if you're changing the focal lens of the camera, cutting away before you reveal something, or using dark lighting to obscure the subject. Promotional art. Marketing your visual novel is very important. You want visuals that are in some way eye-catching, informational on what your VN is about, and draws in people who would enjoy your VN. Saul Bass, the graphic designer responsible for many film posters and title sequences throughout the 50s to 90s, said this about poster designs. My actual entry into film began when Otto Pereminger asked me to design the title for The Man with the Golden Arm. Me using a single symbol to represent the film broke from the general point of view of how you sold films. Before that period, almost all film ads used a potpourri approach. Advertisers threw everything into the pot, using the theory that as a film goer, you would find something in the ad that would inspire you to see the film. If you didn't like one image, you'd like another. The idea of having a film expressed within the framework of one single reductive statement was a very daring notion in the 50s. Saul Bass had three main guidelines to his poster designs: a limited color palette, using white, black, and one or two other colors, the color either being a small contrasting highlight or the main background color. A confident use of negative space with no busyness in the background. And finally, invoking an idea and emotion using a singular image. Let us transition from visuals to writing. Here, we'll talk about two different types of writing, macro and micro. Macro is the big picture of your project script when you zoom out, such as structure, scenes, and plot beats. Micro is when you see close-ups, such as individual lines. Let's start with macro writing. Again, this is structure, scenes, and plot beats. Firstly, structure. You can structure your entire story so that ambiguity can thread throughout it. Here are some methods. Unreliable narrator. This is a framing device wherein the person telling the story may not be telling the whole truth. There can be various reasons for this. They are purposefully lying to the player. They may be hallucinating things, or they're a child or animal and has a more limited understanding of what they're seeing. As an author, writing an unreliable narrator has challenges to execute compared to telling a story traditionally, because it requires you to deliberately mislead the audience and ask readers to question the narrator. Nonlinear storytelling, telling the story out of chronological order. This can make it unclear what happened and when, adding mystery that the player doesn't yet understand but the player character does. The game 30 Flights of Loving is an example of nonlinear story, making the player piece together the plotline. Rashfon style. This is a term for when the same story is narrated by different characters, but there are contradictions between one version and another. They can't all be right, so it's ambiguous what really happened. This framing device is named after a film by director Akira Kurosawa, which follows this narrative style. Scenes. You can also choose what scenes you include in your visual novel. Writers often make the decision to leave out scenes the protagonist experiences that aren't relevant to the plot, but you can also choose to leave out scenes that are key to the plot, to leave the player wondering what exactly happened. A common example of this is in fiction when a character has possibly died, but there isn't a scene when someone finds the body, implying that the character may have survived. World building. Because a plotline is a smaller story contained within a larger world, you often can't include everything you've thought up about your story's setting and timeline. For example, Portal 2 is a game that has you solve button puzzles, but as you explore the test chambers, you're given scraps of information hinting at the facility being much larger than what you get to explore of it, as well as it being abandoned for years, given the amount of plants growing through walls. This creates a backstory that the player speculates on as the story progresses, and then lingers in their thoughts after they finish the story. Some works also leave it ambiguous as to whether magic or supernatural elements exist in the setting. This leaves it to the audience to decide if events happen because of magic or coincidence. Ambiguous time period. The work takes place in the past or future, but it's unclear when exactly. Older technology is used in the place of modern, but no exact date is given in the story. This creates a feeling of timelessness to the work. Endings. The ending of your visual novel is very important to get right, no matter how many your VN has. It's what the plotline has been building up to, so you'll want the destination to feel like the journey was worth it. There are endings labeled as good endings and ones labeled as bad or sad, but there's another type of ending, ambiguous endings. These are endings that pose a question at the end, turn around and say, "What do you think, audience?" If done right, it feels less like a cop-out and more like asking the audience what their interpretation was as an introspection exercise. An example of this is the short story, The Lady or the Tiger, by Frank R. Stockton, which ends with the question, which came out of the opened door, the lady or the tiger, which has implications on the mindset of the protagonist. Would she decide to let her lover be with another, or would she have rather fed him to a tiger? Driving questions. Many stories have a big question that lasts a large portion or the entirety of the story. But when there is so much buildup to a question, is it possible to leave it unanswered? Previous works have proven this question to be a yes. In the first season of Twin Peaks, we don't find out who killed Laura Palmer. It's the inciting incident that brings the protagonist into the small town and makes the townsfolk increasingly more suspicious of each other. In Pulp Fiction, we never find out what is in the briefcase. It's just important to know that it's a MacGuffin the characters want and the characters' reactions to it. In one of my visual novels, Three Guys That Paint, we never find out what's inside the black cube. It's an object one of the characters is searching for, the reason why she traveled to the place the game takes place in, and that it supposedly contains answers to the meaning of life. These driving questions have a function in the story, but being given a straight answer to them would arguably not elevate the story. I'll also touch upon romantic arcs. A driving question in a romance is often the question of, will they or won't they? Will the characters fall in love and be together by the end of the story? There is an interview with game writer and narrative designer Justin Keenan on the detective RPG Disco Elysium. The interviewer asks why the player character couldn't kiss a certain character in the game, and the reply is, because the thing about desire is that it's stronger when it's not totally satisfied, arguing that it's the lack of satisfaction that makes the relationship stay in your mind longer. If your visual novel's focus is romance, this might not be a suitable choice, but if your VN is a different genre, this might be something to consider. Now let's move on to microwriting, the details within individual lines of text. Narration. Writing narration is a challenging thing. You not only want to write what is happening in your plot, but also write it in a way that is interesting. While teaching others about storytelling, director Billy Wilder said, "Let the audience add up 2 + 2. They'll love you forever." When you narrate the story, you're often told to show, don't tell. But how do you do that with writing? Well, you can describe things in a way that gives the reader enough information to come to a conclusion, rather than just saying exactly what is happening like a set of instructions. In a quote attributed to playwright Anton Chekhov, "Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass." Then there's dialogue. Ambiguity in dialogue can be described as subtext, things that are left unspoken but are still there in the work to be found. For dialogue to feel believable, writers include subtext because people often don't say exactly what they mean. While some people can be on the nose with their words, people can also be secretive, self-conscious, have filters, or simply aren't self-aware of their own feelings behind their words. Here's an example from the film A Few Good Men. The first panel is subtext, while the last one is essentially the same line, but with all the subtext removed. Choices. VNs, unless they are entirely linear, have the player select choices that usually change how a scene plays out and determines which ending they get. For the player to properly make decisions and understand their possible consequences, however, it's important to word the choices so that the player knows what each choice does. The meta card game Inscription is thematically about making sacrifices to win. The game rewards you with various items you can use to boost your chances of winning card games against your opponent. One of these items is a set of pliers. When the game gives you a brief description of what the pliers do for you mechanically, you aren't told what they do to your character narratively until you use them. When you do select them, you realize that using the pliers plays a cutscene of your character pulling out one of their own teeth to get a gold tooth, which gives you points, adding to the dark atmosphere of the game about making hard sacrifices. It also teaches you to be expectant of suffering and more wary of other items you collect later in the game. You feel tricked, but you don't feel cheated because you were given an explanation on what would happen mechanically, but not narratively. Be careful, however, on making the choices unintentionally ambiguous and confusing. There's a scene in season 1 of the Wolf Among Us narrative game where you're at a bar with the woodsman's character. One of the options is to glass him. A lot of players, including myself, assumed it meant offer to buy the woodsman a drink, but selecting it made you violently smash a glass cup over his head, which was very surprising to the point where it was unintentionally funny and became a meme. Games that use dialogue wheels with short or one-word descriptions often fall into this pitfall. The game Fallout 4 had several instances where you could select a choice labeled as sarcastic to a yes or no question, making it unclear if it was a yes sarcastic, a no sarcastic, or something else entirely. Moving on from writing to audio. Audio in a visual novel can be divided into music, sound effects, and voice acting. We'll start with music. In Portal 2, the credit song Want You Gone plays with the lyrics displayed on screen. However, when it gets to the line, when I delete you, maybe I'll stop feeling so bad, the line reads as redacted, showing that GLaDOS, who has been an unreliable narrator for the past 2 games, is either in denial of her feelings or is actively trying to hide information. Sound effects. Sound, since it's something you hear rather than see, can often be ambiguous if neither the visuals nor the text of the VN provide context for the source of the sound. The horror game The Space Between has a scene that abruptly cuts to black with the sound of something metallic. At first, it sounds like the click of a gun, a foreshadowing of violence. It increases the tension of the horror game. But as the story progresses, you eventually realize that the sound was a pair of scissors, a recurring symbol the player character uses for trying to cut away the distance he feels between himself and others. The Sexy Brutale is a time loop game where the main objective is to prevent the various guests' murders throughout the mansion. As you walk through the different areas, you'll sometimes hear various sounds in the distance. Out of context, they may seem unimportant, but as you progress and gather more information, you discover the source of the sounds, or what happens when a sound plays, some of which are directly linked with the murders. This means that once you've obtained enough information about the looping timeline, the sounds become flags on what's happening in other areas. Voice acting. If your visual novel has voice acting, you can use ambiguity there as well. You can edit voice acting to obscure information that other characters are experiencing, leaving the player wondering what was said. I'm currently working on a visual novel where the main character hides his name, so whenever his name is mentioned, the audio channel for the voice acting fades out so that the player character doesn't get to hear it. Disco Elysium has moments in the game where the voice actor's dialogue is partially or totally replaced by static white noise, like a radio receiving feedback. It is used either to censor certain words in the game or to show that the player character is in a stupor or otherwise unable to take in the conversation, causing us to miss omitted text and roleplay as someone experiencing a temporary state of semi-consciousness. Let's move on to meta. A metagame is when a game is self-aware that it's a fictional video game, referring to itself or to the conventions of its medium. Meta also refers to elements that are beyond the work, but still related to it in some way, such as the work's title, game achievements, merchandise, or comments by the creators. When we read a story, we play the game of trying to figure out what the writer is trying to say, knowingly or unknowingly. Because we can't read the creator's mind, we fill in the blanks and make assumptions. There are two terms here I'll need to define: death of the author and word of God. Death of the author is the knowledge that when the work is ambiguous about something, the author's interpretation isn't definitive or automatically better. If something didn't inexplicably happen, it's not canon. Word of God is when the creator personally sets the record straight by explaining things outside of the work. This can be done in an interview, through a letter correspondence, or anything that isn't through the work itself. Because of technology, we now have a means to directly contact authors to ask them what they really meant. But ambiguity doesn't answer all the player's questions, and if it's intentional, it shouldn't. This causes a predicament where the audience can ask the author to explain things outside the work, possibly undoing the ambiguity to an extent. But here's the thing: you can choose whether to give an answer or not. An example of this is in the VN I developed, Ghost Switch. Ghost Switch is a wordless VN that uses symbols in the place of dialogue, asking players to interpret it to figure out what the characters are saying. One particular reoccurring line in the game was designed to be harder to parse, which was the blue butterfly. People would ask me what it meant, and while I have my own interpretation of it, I decided in the end to not say what it really meant, because I realized that any answer I gave would be a disappointment compared to what the player had interpreted. In conclusion, ambiguity can be a useful tool in your toolbox for developers. It's also something that I found to be refreshing as a player. Finding something that can be perceived in more ways than one is something that's very beautiful to me. I enjoy having my perception challenged rather than constantly told or confirmed, and I like being invited to think about what I'm seeing or listening to. There is a difference between just leaving something unfinished and intentionally making something ambiguous by design to help push the narrative, and I hope this talk has helped to explain that distinction. Using ambiguity can help make your VN say more by using less. Thank you for listening to my talk. Here are some places where you can find me online, as well as my itch.io page where my games can be found. We can start Q&A now.
Yay. Thank you for that talk. And does anyone have one? We probably have time for one question, maybe two. Okay, any advice on how to market promo a game where much of the appeal lies in behind the prominent early plot twist?
Could you repeat the question again?
Oh, on ambiguity in marketing. Any advice on how to market promo a game where much of the appeal might lie behind a prominent early plot twist?
I would say you'll need to make the choice of, do you want to reveal the plot twist in the marketing itself? And if the answer is no, then instead of saying this is a game where this happens as a plot twist, instead make it clear that there is a plot twist or there is something unexpected, but don't say what it is. And you use as much as you can in the promotional material to do that. If it's a poster, explain that visually as well as in the tagline text. If you have control over the title and you haven't come up with what the title is, try to embody it in some way in that as well. If it's a trailer and it includes a dialogue, try to include bits of dialogue from the game that help to elevate that. And if you can get custom voice acting for the trailer, make sure it helps to elevate that in that way too.
All right, there's like another 1 or 2 questions in chat, but it's time. So thank you so much. Vimy, I believe you are up next.
All right.
It's all yours.